my first experience recreationally with mushrooms. And looking back now, I mean, I'm horrified by just the lack of control, and meaning not control, but lack of supervision, right? I mean, the set and setting ended up being fine. Nothing terrible happened, but there were a lot of ways it could have gone sideways. But that first experience, and I must have consumed in retrospect just a dizzying amount of mushrooms. I mean,
it would be in excess of 5 grams.
It would have been more. Yeah, just knowing what I know now, it would have been.
Kids don't do this at all.
Don't do that.
I'm not gonna say don't do it at home. Don't do it at all.
Yeah.
Please, so, I actually don't think the young developing brain should be exposed to psychedelics.
We could talk about that.
We could talk about that.
Yeah,
I'm going to take my stance. I'm going to take my stance for now.
Yeah, I mean, in the world in which we live in the U.S., I would totally agree with you. There are some interesting cultural exceptions in other places where things are more set up to provide for that type of use, but I certainly would not recommend it. But coming back to my recreational experience, my subjective experience was so bizarre, and my experience of time so nonlinear, my experience of self so different from anything I had experienced up to that point. And therefore, my construction of reality being so completely unlike anything I had experienced was enough to make me want to learn about these compounds. And very early on, I still have a scan of it somewhere. I think it was in 1998 or 99. I actually wrote a paper. One of my junior papers was focused on examining potential similarities between REM sleep and LSD, LSD 25, and looking at some of the patterns of neural activity. Of course, we can do a lot more now with the tools that we have available. But from a scientific perspective, I was very curious about how much we knew and how much we didn't know. And I would say that latter category gets me more excited in a way. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, okay, how much room is there for growth here? Right? Because if we're just putting on the finishing touches with marginal, incremental improvements on something that we feel like we've largely figured out, that's less interesting to me than something that baffles most people examining them on some level. And there was a professor named Barry Jacobs who was doing some very interesting work. He did a lot of work looking at the serotonergic systems and did a lot of work with cats. Ultimately, I could not do personally the animal work required of the sort of indentured servitude that I would.
I think you wrote someplace once. You said when confronted with the prospect of installing a computer printer into the head of a cat,
jack on the back of a cat head.
On the back of a cat head.
They literally had those little VGA ports on the back of these cats' heads because cats sleep a lot, and so they're interesting to study.
A lot of that. Cats. Very few laboratories work on cats any longer. It's mostly a mouse. Still some non-human primate work. My laboratory is essentially shut down, or is in the process of shutting down. Even our mouse work. I much prefer to work on humans. They can give consent and they house themselves. And the animal research thing is tough for any sentient being. Yeah. It's tough.
The cat, for what it's worth, the cats seemed pretty happy. Like they were just sleeping. I mean, the ports were for tracking. So the cats were they were just normal cats. The cats were fine, but we would have been injecting retroviruses into rats and then perfusing them, which means bleeding them to death, to avoid bruising of the tissue. Because then if you're going to take thin slices and scans, you didn't want to have bruising. And I just couldn't do it. I think it's important. I do think there's a place for it, but I couldn't do it. So that's why I transferred out. But the point I was trying to make is that I had the experience, and then I had that drive the scientific interest. And then I had probably one experience per year for a few years after that. And what I noticed for myself personally, because I suffered from major depressive disorder and extended depressive episodes, let's just say on average 3 to 4 a year. And by extended,
even before you had started,
even before,
from a young age,
from very young age. And I would say, so let's just call it 3 to 4 on average a year. Those could last each a few weeks or a few months. I mean, this is a very high percentage of my total year. And when I had these higher dose experiences with with mushrooms, so we're talking about psilocybe mushrooms, and then if we're looking at the molecule that's being examined scientifically, psilocybin, I noticed this afterglow effect that was really durable. And that was an antidepressant effect or a mood elevating effect that lasted far longer than the half-life could explain, right? Because 4 to 6 hours, you're kind of on the other side. And I would experience this afterglow effect for 3 to 6 months. And that raised all sorts of interesting questions. What the hell is going on here? Is it the content? Is it some structural change? There were a lot of unanswered questions for me. And then I had a very, very scary experience that led me to completely stop use of psychedelics, where, again, uncontrolled environment, ended up in rural New York, coming out of my trip, standing in the middle of the road in the middle of the night with headlights coming at me.
Goodness gracious.
So you don't want to do that.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, too dangerous.
Were you taking them alone? Is that how that is?
I was taking them with 2 friends, and my 2 friends, without telling me, just went for a walk and left me alone.
Yeah.
So don't do
it
that.
Points to the, these are powerful compounds.
Yeah, you're playing with nuclear power. Like this is the nuclear power of like psychological or psycho-emotional surgery. Is the way I'd encourage people to think about them. And I stopped using any psychedelics completely. I was still very interested in them, but I basically hit pause. And I didn't revisit that until, let's call it 2012, 2013, where I was still struggling with major depressive disorder. And I saw my girlfriend at the time completely transformed by supervised, facilitated use of, in this case, ayahuasca, which was not quite as common as it is in conversation at the time. And she did that in South America, but she not only explained her experience, but I was able to see the transformation in her that seemed to have some durability over time. And that is when I started stepping back into researching psychedelics, looking at what had been published in the last, let's just call it 10 years, as of that point in time. And thinking about how I would approach it systematically with safeguards, with proper supervision, and basically approaching it the way I would have approached any of the topics in the 4-Hour Body. Mm-hmm. And that is what led me back into, along with a number of other interventions, I should say. So I wasn't betting the farm on psychedelics. I also started TM at that point. I was.
You just some people might transcendental meditation. These are like 4 to 10 day meditation retreats.
This was actually much shorter. It was a 2 or 3 day training, mm-hmm. and you're visiting the instructor. I want to say it's once or twice a day, probably once a day, and getting up to speed. And I did this because I was going through a period of acute stress. This was finishing the 4-Hour Chef. This was actually probably in the years preceding that. And I had one friend who I'd seen really change from, let's just call hyperkinetic high anxiety to low anxiety. And he said, you have the time, you have the money, pay for the course, just take it. Yes, there are all these criticisms of TM. Yes, there are all these weird historical anecdotes of people trying to levitate and all this weirdness. Just ignore that.
Well, trying to levitate, nothing against that. I mean, if you actually levitate, then we got to have a discussion. But trying to levitate seems like
why not?
Every kid tries all sorts of things.
Give it a go. He's like, just put that aside, because I kept coming up with pushback. And he's like, look, all I'm saying is it's like a warm bath for your mind that you take twice a day, and it'll chill you the fuck out. So try it. And I was like, okay, fine.
It's a good endorsement.
I was like, at this point, I had been burning the candle at both ends so intensely. It's like, okay. So there was TM, and then I began examining how I might approach. Notice I didn't just jump into using them. I was like, how could I approach taking psychedelics in a sequence, in a logical sequence, with proper protections, with safety assurances. And that took me probably a month or two. And I was right in the middle of things. In Northern California, you have access to a lot. And only then did I start looking at having my own experiences. And lo and behold, I mean, I'll cut to the chase, but the personal outcome, and there are many different benefits and risks I should make very clear. These things can be extremely dangerous in certain ways. Generally not physiologically, but they can be dangerous. I would say instead of 3 to 4 times per year on average, I probably have one depressive episode every 2 years.
That's a significant improvement.
Yeah, right. I mean, from a quality of life perspective, those are two different people. Mm-hmm. And that then led me to, as I did with all my workouts, right? I took copious notes over the span. I mean, now we're looking at 10 plus years. So if I were to ever write another book, it would probably be related to all of the really fine details of the experiments and my learnings, including some of the more bizarre things over the last 10 years. But it would be just a beast to create. So
with psychedelics, experiences with
psychedelics and sort of psychedelic adjacent, non-ordinary experiences of consciousness, which I think often are touching at edges of the same thing, which is going to be controversial for some folks. But to come back to the storyline, just to put a bow on that, when I saw the personal outcomes for me, the anecdata from friends who are facilitators who have worked with thousands of people, right? Which is a pretty good sample size. Mm-hmm. Still anecdote, but these are people who are very smart, who keep records. And I believe that these people have spotted patterns that are only going to be possible to test and verify over the next 5 to 10 years. So I at least as a means of generating hypotheses, I take these people very seriously. And then I started to connect with scientists whose work I had read, like Roland Griffiths at Johns Hopkins, began looking at the most compelling data related to, say, MDMA-assisted psychotherapy and complex PTSD. I made the commitment to myself that as soon as I had enough money to move the dial, because I really felt like these tools were so outside of the normal paradigm of psychiatry and pharmacology. And that made me very excited because it was uncrowded. There's very little funding coming into the space. It was high leverage. And I looked at it just as I've looked at my many startup investments, limited downside risk, really high upside potential. And I should say before that, I'd already been funding in a very small way science. So the first check I ever wrote was personally to Adam Ghazali's lab at UCSF.
Yeah, great lab.
Which at the time was looking at software. He's not going to like this description, but I'm going to simplify it. Software that might attenuate or reverse age-related cognitive impairment, specifically related to various aspects of attention. And that was my first foray into funding early stage science, which was very analogous to me to funding early stage startups. And then later on, to touch on the reputational thing, I know this is a TED Talk, so thank you for listening.
No, this is great. Please, you're always so gracious on your podcast. This is what people want. Yeah. This is certainly what I want to hear. So
on the reputational side, you're right that at the time, especially, let's just call it 2013 to 2015, this was not a comfortable national conversation of any type.
Yeah, I wouldn't have had this conversation back then.
No way.
I'd lose. I don't know that I would have lost my job. It just would have raised a lot of eyebrows. Yeah. And now that such studies are happening at Stanford.
Yeah, the perception was that these are a professional third rail, at the very least, right? Also illegal, therefore, if I talk about them, am I giving someone probable cause? Am I going to get myself in some type of really tricky legal situation, et cetera? There are a lot of considerations. But I tested that. Just like I was saying, I like to capture my assumptions on paper so I can stress test. And I was like, okay, I think that might be true. Most people I know think that is true. But is it true? How could we test to see if that is true or not? And I decided to crowdfund for a Hopkins pilot study looking at psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. And I thought to myself, okay, we have a couple of things falling in our favor here. Number one, depression does not discriminate. So across socioeconomic classes, across gender, across race, this is a problem. almost everyone knows someone who takes antidepressants who is still depressed. Okay. Treatment-resistant depression, therefore, is the indication. Psilocybin is the intervention. Let me crowdfund, and I did that throughout the time, CrowdRise, which was co-founded by Edward Norton, who had become a friend and was
the actor, Edward Norton.
Who's very smart, very, very, very smart. Also one of the best investors I've ever met, which a lot of people don't know. Very bright guy. And so crowdfunded, and I also like to put my money where my mouth is. So I said, okay, guys, I'm going to seed this. Like, I'm putting in X. The goal is to raise, I think it was 80,000, something like that, for the following study. And then I was like, let's see what happens. And there was basically zero negative blowback. And not only was there no discernible negative blowback, a number of people, and this was deliberate, I wanted to see this, a number of people came out of the woodwork to support in a bigger way. And I was like, oh, okay, I see you. A handful of folks I knew. And I was like, oh, interesting. Okay, there are at least a half a dozen folks who are studying the same thing or paying attention to the same thing. And then I just got bolder. I was like, okay, if I tested that, let me push, and then let's see what happens, and I'll wait. And lo and behold, I realized that the perception did not match the reality. The reality was, if you're talking about indications that cause an incredible amount of suffering for a very large number of people, even those who are anti-drug per se, just say no to drugs, want solutions. And the current treatments for many of these things do not work very well. And in the best of cases are often masking symptoms and not addressing root causes, I would say. So at that point, I just went whole hog and I said, okay, look, I like to think that I am exactly what you see is what you get, right? The person you talk to off camera, the person you talk to on camera, same. And if I start feeling like I have too much to protect, I want to do something to counteract that. In other words, if I feel like I need to censor my true feelings and beliefs, maybe not share my hardships, perhaps not promote certain things because I have a reputation to lose, that's a fragile position. I want to be as anti-fragile as possible. And so by talking about this, I viewed it as a way of inoculating myself against fear of reputation loss. Like, okay, let me push this. Like, I'll ride this horse. Other people might not, but I wanted to remove the stigma for funding purposes, hopefully open up federal funding. That's starting to happen now from different agencies. And then to focus on access and reduction of cost and insurance reimbursement and so on. So I set a game plan, let's call it maybe 5 years ago, and I've just been slowly, methodically executing on that since. And the reason I chose this to focus on, and I've funded other things, but I've really focused on this, mental health therapeutics, which is not limited to psychedelics. And we can talk about some other things that I find interesting, but psychedelics are, like I said, what makes it attractive. Very uncrowded. You can do a lot with a small amount of money, unlike, say, in cancer research. It can be very hard. Like, okay, you're a decabillionaire, great. Maybe you can do something interesting. And I'm sure other people could. But if you have $20,000, $50,000, it's going to be hard to make a dent there. In psychedelics, you can actually still make a difference. And very high leverage, in part because these compounds seem to challenge much of what we assume to be true about treating mental health. And so that makes for an attractive bet. So that's where I've been going.
Yeah, I'm so glad you shared that with us and that you did that exploration, and that you've been spearheading the funding efforts. This podcast has a premium channel that's for raising funds for scientific studies. We are in the process now making our first 4 contributions. One of those includes work in Nolan Williams' laboratory at Stanford, combining transcranial magnetic stimulation with studies of ibogaine and 5-MeO DMT, maybe a few other things. But basically, that he's free to do what he wants with the funds. We trust him to do great work. But that, again, was inspired by you, right? A podcast with a scientific slant, certainly. This podcast obviously has a scientific slant, but the idea of doing philanthropy for the sorts of work that really deserves funding and exploration. And by the way, and thinking about other hybrid things that would be fun to do. I mean, I would love to contribute and join those efforts because the
Amazing.
work to continue to raise funding for psychedelic studies and all these great laboratories continues, right?
It continues.
Yeah. And you've rallied a collection of some pretty powerful people to contribute to this. And I know you've joined arms with Michael Pollan. In many ways. Do you want to talk about the fellowships that you guys put together? I find that really cool. You've got fellowships in the works or maybe already happening at UC Berkeley. Is that right?
At UC Berkeley, yeah. So what I try to do, and for people who want to check it out, it's the name of the foundation is SciSay Foundation, and let me explain that for a second. So it's SAISEI. So SciSayFoundation.org. I speak Japanese. I went there as an exchange student and speak, read, and write it still to this day pretty well. Saisei can mean a lot of things. It means rebirth in Japanese. And I've seen what can only be described or can certainly be described as rebirth in so many clinical outcomes that I thought it was appropriate to use. And what I've tried to do with the foundation is, I think, do what I'm pretty good at, which is trying to peek around corners and find something to prototype, right? So just like the CGM and like, all right, how can I, just getting a hold of a Dexcom back then when it was just for type 1 diabetics was hard. It was
the thing that you have to actually go under the skin.
It's like taking a barbecue prong and putting it under your abdominal skin. It was not comfortable.
Can you describe your cortisol level in subjective terms when you're at home? You got this thing and you're about to implant it and you don't have any precedent. It's not like this is, like Levels or one of these other CGMs that are out there. You stamp the thing in, you can look on Instagram and see someone else do it. There's nothing like that. So you're at home wondering if you're going to skewer your liver.
Yeah, I'm at home doing it myself and I'm sweating like a stuck pig. I'm sitting there. I'm like, oh my God, I don't even know if I can hold on.
Is your girlfriend there like to support you in case you die?
I think at the time she wasn't because she was squeamish and didn't want to see it. And I'm sitting there at my kitchen table. I remember this. God, I'm sweating just thinking about it. And no videos to watch. And wasn't really supposed to have it in the first place. And the device for readout, by the way, no iPhone, right?
Right.
So it's like this janky pager looking thing that had a readout that made you think you were playing Pong or something. I mean, it was very
the green tint screen.
Green tint
with
screen.
Dot font.
It was so primitive. And put this thing under my skin, would tape, I would cut a Ziploc bag and put it on top and masking tape it to my skin to take showers because otherwise it wouldn't work. And it was great. And I'll just say that I don't use a CGM.
It was great. You realize you said it was great.
I did say it was great because
I'm sweating and I was afraid.
But it gave me a lot of insight.
Okay.
And then once I had the insight over a course of a handful of weeks, then I felt like I didn't really need it anymore. And that was also just a heavy tax to pay to have to wear that thing around, look like you have what is it called? A colostomy bag or something. And it's just like, it was big, it was bulky. So just like I did that, I wanted to do proof of concept, right? The goal was, can I use this for healthy, normal applications? Will the insights be actionable? And they were, lo and behold. Similarly with the foundation, since I'm dealing with smaller amounts of money, I'm not in the billionaire club by any stretch of the imagination, and science can be expensive. I'm looking for small bets. Where can I pilot something that, if successful, will be emulated or can be scaled? And so the crowdfunding for the Hopkins treatment-resistant depression pilot study, we ended up exceeding the goal. They were able to recruit more subjects. In the case of UC Berkeley, Michael Pollan and I partnered on this, and my foundation funded it. The Ferris UC Berkeley Journalism Fellowship, Psychedelic Journalism Fellowship, is providing funding to up-and-coming journalists who want to focus on psychedelics as their beat, which to this date has not been financially feasible. You just don't have the space to do really long-form investigative work. The hope being that these journalists can apply their skills and their dedication to examining different facets of the psychedelic ecosystem, therapeutic potential, regulatory issues, etc., in a way that can shape and inform national and international discourse in a very critical way, because these things are not a panacea. There's a lot of claims that are made about these that are totally unbacked by any type of science. And there are a lot of charlatans. And so I wanted to also invite really competent, really good journalists to the table who might want to watch for bad actors. I think that's really important. And so this fellowship has been awarding fellows with these grants. And I think it's a relatively small amount of money. It's like $10,000 per, something like that. But the outcomes have been amazing. We had a huge, I want to say it was 7,000 word piece that was one of the main features in Rolling Stone magazine. Huge piece in National Geographic focused on iboga and fair trade and some of the implications for local harvesting and or over harvesting, all the dynamics present in that, which I think has some incredible promise for particular forms of opioid use disorder in particular. But that has been a huge success. So the hope is that other journalism schools will say that's a great idea. And I will have de-risked it for some other philanthropist or foundation or government, say, director at an agency to say, okay, we'll greenlight that. Right? Because I've done it and it's been received very well and it's had a real impact on how things are moving along. Another one would be, say, at Harvard Poplar. This is at Harvard Law School. It's the first dedicated team focused on law, policy, and regulation related to psychedelics from a legal perspective.
Super important.
Super important. Also, another pilot, let's just call it, proof of concept that SciSafe Foundation funded was helping to develop curricula for, I think it was Yale, Johns Hopkins, and NYU, effectively an accreditation or a module that they could put into their existing psychiatry MD programs such that people could develop the skills necessary and the understanding necessary to administer psychedelic assisted therapies if and when they become legal, prescribable.
Which, if I understand correctly, it sounds like within the next 12 to 24 months, MDMA assisted psychotherapy for the treatment of trauma is likely to become legal in the hands of psychiatrists, at least, and maybe certain clinical psychologists as well in the U.S. Is that right? Through the efforts of the MAPS group.
Yeah, through the efforts of MAPS.org and Rick Doblin and many others. That is the tip of the spear. So I think anyone who's interested in psychedelics should have a vested interest in supporting those efforts. Not because we know everything works. I want to be clear. Not because we know a priori that all these things do all the things. No. But if MDMA fails, it's going to be very hard to draft. It'll be impossible to draft on that with compounds that are more difficult to administer, like psilocybin, which would be next in line for alcohol use disorder, also major depressive disorder. So I really feel that just like everything I've talked about, whether it's networking, putting together the 4-Hour Body, or trying to change national policy and, say, reclassification of these compounds, getting them out of Schedule 1 to some extent. You want to break it down into its constituent pieces. You want to do an 80-20 analysis, figure out what the critical few are, and then put them in a logical sequence and execute the plan. One of the greatest weaknesses in the psychedelic ecosystem is there are a lot of people who just want to do all the things and save all the people and all the animals and all the places all at once. Yeah. And that just doesn't work very well. There are also some really good people who are executing. And we could talk about the for-profit side and so on. But I've been very, very, very pleased with the outcomes that SciSafe Foundation has been able to achieve with very limited money. I'm prouder of those outcomes than I am of the startup record. And the startup record's pretty good. Mm-hmm. And it's the same lens. I'm using the same filters and the same approach, which is kind of what I'm always looking for. I'm looking for stuff that'll translate across fields if possible. And then you mentioned one like TMS. I think TMS, very interesting.
Transcranial magnetic stimulation. Yeah, which at one point was more commonly used to inhibit specific brain areas. This is a non-invasive technique. I've had it done where it's over my motor cortex and you're tapping your finger and all of a sudden you can't tap your fingers. It's pretty eerie, but now it can be used to stimulate at particular frequencies, enhance neuroplasticity. And in combination with psychedelics it's kind of the burning question now. Can you get a synergistic effect of TMS and psychedelics? Maybe not just during the psilocybin or iboga journey, but in the days and weeks after, when we know for sure a lot of plasticity is still occurring. So keep the plasticity on board or accelerate it.
So TMS also as a monotherapy, very interesting to me for depression, anxiety, even substance use disorders, super interesting. And there are many different protocols, all sorts of different technology. I would say low intensity or low power ultrasound, also super interesting for various applications, potentially to addiction. So I'm not, to be clear, a card carrying evangelist for psychedelics. I am a proponent of looking for high leverage, uncrowded bets with limited downside and testing them out. And very optimistic about psychedelics. If anyone listening has a family history of, say, schizophrenia, borderline personality disorder, which this is being very simplistic, but categorize or describe as more sort of chaotic conditions compared to hyper rigid conditions like an OCD or anorexia nervosa, chronic depression, et cetera. And we can talk about why some of these psychedelics, at least some of the classical psychedelics, seem to have cross efficacy with multiple conditions. But psychedelics seem very helpful for certain types of hyperrigidity. When you get into schizophrenia and borderline personality disorder, they can be really heavily contraindicated. Not to say that they cause those conditions, but they can precipitate the onset of those symptoms, and for that reason can be very destabilizing and dangerous for certain people. However, that's where something like metabolic psychiatry comes in, and the use of ketosis and the ketogenic diet, which appears to be very effective in some patients for that grouping of, say, more chaotic conditions, which is very exciting. So I'm interested in any tools that are off the beaten path that seem to raise interesting questions that have not been answered in a satisfying way yet in medicine. And I think we're still largely in the dark ages with respect to psychiatry.
Oh, I think the best psychiatrists would agree with you.
Yeah. And the best psychiatrists and the best scientists and the best fill in the blank are acutely aware of the limitations of our current methods and the limitations of our current knowledge. So I think the mark of a good thinker, the mark of a good scientist, the mark of a good fill in the blank anything is someone who says, I have no idea, or we have no idea, a lot.
And hopefully they also say, let's go figure it out, try some things.
Yeah.
And I really want to thank you for sharing that narrative, especially because it makes clear that you brought the same systematic process of using and asking excellent questions to arrive at solutions, to arrive at more questions, to fund areas of inquiry, and to do it all in this really structured way. As you said, from policy all the way down to like how many grams or, X of some substance somebody might take. I mean, I think Matthew Johnson's laboratory at Hopkins, Roland Griffiths, Robin Cardart Harris at UCSF, Nolan Williams, the MAPS group, Rick Doblin,
Peter Hendricks at University of Alabama, looking at cocaine addiction, and other things.
Yeah, you, Michael Pollan. I'm leaving some names out here, and I don't want to take anything away from the classic, as they're called, explorers of psychedelics and writers about psychedelics. But we are in the moment of a renaissance now, and it's important that this have a lot of fuel. So we'll put a link to your philanthropy efforts and the journalism fellowships as well, because I think there's going to be a lot of interest there. And I'm a huge supporter of what you're doing, as you know, and I just think it's the way great science and clinical progress is made. So
thanks, Andrew.
Yeah, which brings me to another parallel topic. You know, it used to be that meditation and psychedelics were nested in the same territory. This would be in the late 60s, early 70s, the birth of places like Esalen, et cetera, or the consequence of the dual exploration of those things. Meditation sort of escaped from the psychedelics umbrella and vice versa, starting sometime in the mid 2000s when neuroimaging became a little bit more accessible. And I think nowadays, if you told anybody, okay, meditation's good for you, it can help ratchet down your anxiety, give more self-awareness, improve sleep, and on, maybe even give some insight into consciousness, no one's going to balk. There's just a lot of studies. There's thousands of studies. Yeah. My laboratory's done a few of them. There are other laboratories who have done far more. The book Altered Traits is the one that comes to mind. The group out of Wisconsin was early to the game on this. In any event, you talked about TM. Mm-hmm. I'm curious from a practical standpoint, do you still meditate daily? Do you do meditation retreats? What sorts of meditative practices do you have? Because I realize this can be done walking, writing is its own form of meditation. What sorts of formal practices do you still engage in now?
Yeah, I do 10 to 20 minutes in the morning. So I am not currently doing the TM twice daily, 20 minutes. I think that would be better for me, probably.
Mm-hmm. Do you set a clock and
I'll set a clock, which would be more of the concentration practice of, say, a TM where you're repeating a mantra. Honestly, it could be any, in my opinion, some TM purists will balk at this, but it could be really any nonsense syllable, could be a word, although I think something without any attached meaning is probably more beneficial for a host of reasons. So it could be a concentration practice with 20 minutes of sitting. It might also be a guided meditation, and I have no vested interest in this app, but I think the Waking Up app by Sam Harris is fantastic.
As do I.
I have used the introductory course, which is Sam leading you through my catnip, which is a logical progression of skill development from day 1, 2, 3, and forward. I have gone through that course multiple times when I'm getting back on the horse for meditation as a bit of a reboot. Once you develop, I think, a certain degree of awareness and mindfulness, I do think there are other activities that probably allow you the parallel experience of doing one thing while experiencing some of the benefits of meditation. And so for me, I wonder at times, are the benefits of meditation, the concentration practice itself, is it just sitting still with my eyes closed, down-regulating my system a little bit, activating my parasympathetic, and not rushing or doing anything for 20 minutes? Mm-hmm. Is that it? Maybe. Is it simply correcting my posture for 20 minutes? How do I weight these different inputs? And the short answer is you probably don't need to know, but I have found that spending time in silence, in nature, without anything to do, disallowing myself from doing things, no note taking, no reading, etc., and I have spent a number of extended fasts in nature, just like water only by myself, no talking, no reading, no writing.
What's extended?
7 days, generally.
Wow. So you're camping in nature with just water.
Yep, that's it, by myself. And there are risks associated with that, right? You got to be careful, not stupid about it. But that does a lot for me with some persistent benefits.
Are there some favorite places that you've gone into nature? It doesn't have to be to fast. Like, for instance, I'm a big fan of some of the national parks up in the Pacific Northwest because it's like being transported to a different planet. Yosemite is obviously amazing, but any favorite spots where people won't go looking for you there? Don't worry.
Yeah, I would.
You live in Austin all the time, so
that's right. Yeah, so I would say Colorado, Utah, New Mexico. Spending time in mountains, around rivers, lakes, I find very therapeutic and just gorgeous. I do think we suffer from awe deficiency disorder, a bit of ADD when we're trapped in the mundane for too long with too much distraction, with too many to-dos, with too many relationships. And there's no space for awe there. There isn't the room necessary. Awe isn't, from my perspective, generally a quick hit that you get in the 30 seconds between using two apps. there's more breathing room required for a genuine transcendent experience of awe. So I try to, on a yearly basis, as one of my top priorities, block out these weeks of time in nature.
Yeah. Last year was the first year I did that. I went out to Colorado in August and just took daily hikes. I stayed in a hotel. I'm not as beastie as you doing water fast. I was eating every day, but it was spectacular. One thing I noticed, and I'd like to know your process on, how do you handle going back into life?
Great question.
Because those days were and are amazing, right? You like detached and, maybe one text message here or there, or in between hikes or something. And then you just really clued in. Even the process of watching a show at night, like one felt so rich and like enough. Oh, yeah. So I wasn't as aesthetic as you and like really cleaned all the clutter. But once you return to life, it's almost like being awash in demands. And I can see from a place of more equanimity how one could make better choices. But how do you handle those transitions?
The reentry.
Yeah.
So before getting to the reentry, I think it might make sense for me to talk about what comes before. So let's say it's like pre, during, post. Part of the reason I do these 1 week or longer periods off the grid is because it forces me to put better systems in place. So there's the benefit that you derive from, say, that week. And I have 3 weeks coming up right after this interview where I'm going to be off the grid. To set myself up for 3 weeks off the grid, I have a team. I have the podcast. I have a lot of things that are in motion at any given point in time. If you disappear for, say, a 2 to 4 week period, generally you cannot let the whole house catch on fire, then come back and put it out effectively, which means you need to put some policies and rules and so on in place in advance. And there's a carryover effect that has a host of benefits and makes things smoother for the reentry. So they're related. Like the more you set up the pre, the easier the post is going to be. And then you have this beautiful, expansive experience in nature, whatever it might be, whether you're making it a sufferfest like I do or at a hotel at night. Either way, these things can work. And nature in and of itself is super helpful. I do think that a lot of the time we like to imagine, because we're driven, smart, accomplished people, that our problems are very complex. And at the end of the day, it's like you just need some time in nature and a cold shower and some fucking macadamia nuts and you'll be fine. You don't need to solve like all the existential dilemmas of humankind actually, or fancy pharmaceuticals. So you have this experience over this week. And what I will do then is set at least a, let's call it integration period of 2 to 3 days where I will slowly edge back in to my previous routine. I will not, within 12 hours of getting back to so-called civilization, have a day full of calls or meetings. I will not do that. It's too much of a shock to the system. And I think it robs you of a tail end of benefits, which would also be the case with, say, fast or ketogenic diet or any number of interventions. You can squeeze out a long tail of benefits if you make a handful of changes. For instance, after an extended fast, what if you started with a subcaloric ketogenic diet for a few days? You get to extend some of the benefits as opposed to going straight back to, say, a diet that includes a lot of carbohydrates. Similarly, when you create more of a vacuum, more space for awe, insight, reflection, recovery, I think you're doing yourself a disservice if you jump from park into sixth gear. And so I plan for that. And it's a function of scheduling. I also have a predictable weekly schedule. So I tend to schedule podcast recordings on Mondays and Fridays. In preparation for an extended trip, I will batch a lot of similar activities that we have, say, a bunch of episodes in the bank that are pre-scheduled. Everything is figured out in advance. And over time, the more you take these breaks, the better your systems become and the more liberated you are from the day-to-day, which means when you get back, you also don't need to rush as much into hyperactivity. And if you do, you know that that is more from a compulsivity than from a necessity.
While you're on these nature retreats, are you writing on a daily basis? Or are you just thinking and allowing thoughts to enter and leave your system?
Depends on the retreat. So sometimes I'm writing, but writing, I think, can underscore for me a desire to be compulsively productive. And I think that is inversely correlated to my happiness or sense of well-being a lot of the time. So there are many areas in my life now. So if you were to ask me, like, what has changed significantly since the time that you wrote The 4-Hour Body, I would say that rather than looking for areas to optimize, I am looking where I can very deliberately de-optimize certain areas to increase sense of well-being. Where can I de-optimize? Where can I stop measuring? Where can I stop reading books? Which areas can I ignore completely? What types of information can I just excise from my life altogether for a period of time? Delete Twitter. Stop reading about books in X related to, say, AI or whatever it might be. Like, where can I de-optimize selectively to sort of optimize the whole? Does that make sense?
Makes good sense. Yeah.
And before we started recording, I gave you a book, which is a short collection of poetry by Halaliza Ghaffori, which is called Gold. It's a collection of Rumi poetry. Reading poetry is an activity almost by definition, which is the antithesis of optimization. So I've tried to also integrate more of those activities into my life. And this relates to your question, because there are times when I will just force myself to sit on my goddamn hands and not write, not read. Just do the thing that is so uncomfortable sometimes, which is just sitting there with yourself.
It can be incredibly uncomfortable, and in part because of the fear that it could become comfortable.
Yeah.
Right? Especially for proactive people with a strong, well, to use Paul Conti's words, generative drive. You're going to, that's, which is a good thing. I believe
it's a good thing. And it can be a good thing. It can indicate really incredible adaptations. It can also sometimes, I think, indicate maladaptations. Mm-hmm. Right. And so I think it's helpful to take a break from that generative drive, or at least just put it in park position to see if that generative drive is perhaps indicative of you leaning towards something in a healthy, proactive way versus running from something in a long-term destructive way.
Yeah. Well, and I think Paul would say that part of the generative drive process is peace, not as necessarily even as a still state, but as a, being able to experience peace even in the transitions. And there's a lot more to say about that. And he would say it far better than I ever would. So I'll leave it at that. And
I mean, for people who have the option, getting in nature, it doesn't have to be all day, every day on a water fast. I just take certain things to an extreme because that's who I am. But
sorry, when you say water fast, that means fasting with water.
Right. It just
fasting, but yes, drinking water.
It just means you're allowed to have water and nothing else.
For a long time, I thought it meant that you're not drinking water.
Oh, yeah. No, don't do that.
Some people do that, right? They do these crazy food water fasts as a way. I think they believe it clears senescent cells or something, but probably clears a lot more than just senescent cells.
Yeah, there might be something to it. I mean, look, there are people who recycle by drinking their own urine. Not my jam, but I would say it's like 3 hours without shelter, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food. General rule of thumb. So be careful with dehydration. You can go a long time without food. If you have, I don't care how ripped you are. You got 8% body fat, man. You got plenty of time. You can go a couple of weeks. No problem.
Yeah, you got calories stocked
9,000 calories per pound stored body fat. You got plenty. Don't worry. So for people who have the option to be in nature and just exercise several hours a day to exhaustion, see how many of your problems seem to just go away. Just try that.
Yeah, well, my Sunday routine is to try and get outside and move as much as possible.
Yeah,
I don't always succeed, but I'm going to try a longer retreat into nature. I think Olympic National Forest is calling me again. It seems like once a year I just want to get back up there. It's
calling. You should get back out there.
It's spectacular. I have a question about mentors. Mm-hmm. I'm a big believer in mentors, either mentors that know us and we know them, or people that we assign as mentors without them realizing it, this sort of thing. Do you have mentors at this stage of life? for particular areas of life? Or are you you mentoring yourself? Are you flying with a few voices in your head that serve you well? Who are your mentors?
I definitely have people I consider mentors. I think at this point, rarely one way, in the sense that they tend to be friends I spend time with. They get something from it. I get something from it. Not in a transactional way, but they find it fun or beneficial or amusing, in some way redeeming, to spend time with me. That's the hope.
But how is that different from like traditional friendship? Just sort of standard friendship. Are you Are you spending time with some orientation toward like they're embodying areas of life that you would like to emulate?
Totally. I mean, I spend time around people I hope to be more like in some way, because guess what? You're going to average into, say, the sum holistic whole of the 5 or 6 people you spend the most time with. So you should choose that very carefully. That includes virtual parasocial relationships. It's like, okay, if you're listening to fill in the blank person for 4 hours a week, 5 hours a week, 2 hours a week, whoever that group is comprised of is going to influence who you become. And for me, then, I think carefully about my friendships, and they could be older, like Kevin Kelly, who's become a good friend, who has a wealth of life experience that I don't have. And so I might just call him and say, Kevin, I have a question for you. But I do that with my younger friends too. And they could be younger than I am, and I might still view them as a mentor in X, Y, or Z. I think mentor has a heavy weight to it. It has a connotation of maybe never ending, time consuming obligation. So I would never, for instance, and I know a lot of people try this, ask someone to be my mentor. It's like, would you like to be my free life coach forever? It's like, that's kind of how it sounds to the recipient.
Right. So it sounds very formal.
Yeah, it sounds very formal.
Yeah.
So for me, I would say there have certainly been mentors. I've had wrestling coaches. I've had teachers. I've had resident advisors who were reverends who had a huge impact on my life and followed up with me and paid attention to me and cared for me in more of a one-directional sense, right? I view myself as the beneficiary. Of course, they certainly got something out of it if they had that job. I mean, they probably found it to be very gratifying in its own way. And teachers like Professor Ed Shao at Princeton, I feel incredibly indebted to. These days, and for a long time, I've believed that you can learn something powerful from almost anyone, probably anyone you interact with. Could be an Uber driver, could be someone taking garbage out of a restaurant. If you really take the time to dig, you can find something. And before you can, I think as an adult, effectively think about who you would like to learn from, if I put it that way, it's helpful to have a baseline of self-awareness that you know what you might want to work on to either amplify strengths, develop skills, address weaknesses. And so, for instance, one of my close friends, Matt Mullenweg, is younger than I am. He's the founder of Automatic, which runs WordPress.com. He was the lead developer of WordPress, although it was an open source project, of course, with many, many contributors. He was one of the lead developers, now powers something like 32% of the internet. And he exemplifies a cool and calm temperament, even in the most chaotic periods imaginable, during the most chaotic events imaginable. And when I find myself getting dysregulated, to use a fancy term, losing my shit, or getting carried away by emotion, getting righteously angry, or whatever it might be, and I recognize at some point that it's really not serving me, and that I am being owned by the emotion, right? Like I'm the dog on the leash, not the other way around. Then I think of Matt. I'm like, what would Matt do? What advice would Matt give me right now? How would Matt act in these circumstances? And I do that with many friends. I also think a lot about, and this is borrowing from someone named Kathy Sierra from a long time ago, focusing more on just-in-time information as opposed to just-in-case information. So just-in-case information is like, I'm going to read these 20 books because in 2 years I might be interested in X, Y, and Z. That, I think, is often a waste of time because if it ever becomes relevant, you're just going to have to reread those books. People do the same thing with humans. They're like, I want to meet so-and-so and have them as my mentor because maybe 5 years from now I'll do X, Y, and Z, and then they'll be useful for ABC. That's too speculative. And I think it ends up in a lot of wasted energy. So the podcast for me, writing the books and doing the interviews, even prior to the podcast, becoming involved with startups, delving into the world of science and scientists, all helps me to develop a confidence that almost any question I could ask, I can find some semblance of an answer for by just reaching out to a few people and saying, who do you know who might be able to answer this? Mm-hmm. And that's very reassuring, and it relieves some of the anxiety or pressure that people might feel to assemble some personal board of directors of like X-men and women who can help them with everything. And then there are people I hire to be accountable to, right? So I might work with coaches, therapists, and so on, who I would view as mentors. They just happen to be getting paid for it.
Right. Yeah. The reason I asked the question is because we were talking about the meditative process going into nature, and even with psychedelics, there's, it can be viewed a lot of different ways, but I think of them largely as going inward to explore. I mean, you're out in nature and learning from nature. There's such a core truth to nature. I know that sounds a little bit, wishy-washy, but it's true. Like it's there, it's concrete, it's really something. It was there long before any of us, and it'll be there a lot longer than any of us will ever be. We hope. Certainly if it goes, we go. But the process of learning from others and paying attention to others is really an outward looking thing. I mean, we have to bring that in, but I was just curious how you balance those, and as a way to really understand not just your time allocation, right? I think we could talk about that, how's your morning structured, et cetera, which I think there's great value in knowing, but more, what's your mind allocation? Right. Yeah. I think about this, like, where's my brain? Am I focused on what's going on in here? And, is there a need to excavate there? Sure. But how much time am I out of my head and bringing things in from the outside world and back and forth? So do you have some sense of, across the year, across the day, how you mind allocate? I don't know if, that's the best phrase, but I can't think of any better one. If you can think of a better one, please table it, because I'm happy to use that.
How do I think about mind allocation or attention allocation? I try to, and most frequently, think of my mind share across a year and across a weekly time frame. And I find that to be manageable in the sense that on a yearly basis, on New Year's Eve or roughly around New Year's, every year I'll do a past year review, PYR, past year review, where I'll go back and I'll look at my entire last year. I'll have a piece of paper in front of me, line down the center, plus, negative. And I will go through every week in my calendar for the previous year, and I will write down the people, places, activities, commitments, etc., that produced peak positive emotional experiences. So, right, we're doing an 80-20 analysis here. Like, what are the big rocks that really moved the needle in a meaningful way? And conversely, who are the people? What are the things? What are the places that just made me go, ugh, and were draining, produced peak negative experiences? Why the hell did I commit to this type experiences? And that presents me with a do more of, do less of list. Then I look forward to the next year. And I did this, I suppose, just a handful of months ago around New Year's with the positive. I'm like, okay, here's my list of do more of. It's not real until it's in the calendar. Let's get these things in the calendar. And then I will start talking to people, booking things, having people help with organizing. if that is required, and getting things blocked out. So I have already this year, and we're in the reasonable beginning stages of the year, I have things blocked out until November of this year. And those provide the breaks in the action, not just the breaks in the action, but the fun stuff. Because by the way, guys, I thought for a long time, like, yeah, you take care of A, B, and C and the good stuff just takes care of itself. I do not any longer believe that to be true. Unless you schedule these things that you claim are important, they're going to get crowded out by bullshit. And maybe not bullshit, but just less important things. The urgent will crush the important. So I get these things on the calendar, and then I back up and I look at optimal weekly mind allocation, right? Attentional allocation. And there's an incredible cost to cognitive switching if you're just task switching all day. So I will try my best to format a weekly rhythm, a weekly sequence that allows me to focus on certain types of tasks. So Monday is very frequently admin of some type, just bits and ends, flotsam, jetsam, all the miscellaneous pieces that are part of life. You got to deal with them.
Yeah.
That tends to be Monday. Whenever possible, and especially if I am focused on physical activity, let's just say I'm in a place like Colorado, I will try to schedule most of that for after lunch to ensure that I get in a lot of exercise and movement in the first portion of the day. Not everybody has that ability, but I will say more of you have that capacity than you might think, because most of what we all do is just not important.
Yeah. So, time on social media first thing in the morning is probably the most poisonous activity that I could take part in. I don't want to point fingers at anyone else, but I think if people ask what is the amount of time it takes to get in a really good workout, it's going to be about an hour.
Yep.
But a lot can be done in 45 or even 30 minutes. Mm-hmm. You think about how quickly that time goes by on social media.
I'm sure I'm not the only one that is part of the reason I deleted a lot of these apps from my phone. It's like I'd go into the bathroom to take a quick bit of business, and then 45 minutes later, I'm like, how have I been looking at Instagram for 45 minutes?
Yeah. Lines for restrooms have gotten very long in the last 10 years. Has anyone noticed that? The wait for the restrooms has gotten very long.
So you have time for the important stuff. It's like, and just look at some of the extreme overachievers out there. They have the same amount of time that you do.
I was going to ask this later, but we'll just quickly interject this now. I saw, perhaps it was on Twitter, or maybe I overheard this, that you're back on Instagram. It's, you've always had an account that posts, but are you back in there? Or are you out of there?
Look, the dirty little secret, I'm single again, and that's a great way to connect with eligible ladies who might be of interest.
Got it.
It's Instagram.
So you're on Instagram.
I'm willing to pay the tax of dealing with the brain damage of using Instagram as a result.
Hey, look, finding a great life partner is great.
Exactly. So that is the reason for that. But otherwise, it would not be on my phone. It
wouldn't even be on your phone.
Absolutely not. It's too well designed.
Mm-hmm.
These companies are very smart. They have very good data scientists. They are very good UI specialists. If anyone out there thinks that they can, look, maybe Jocko can discipline his way through it. I'm sure he can, because he is Jocko. But in my case, and in the case of most people, like, you're bringing a knife to a gunfight if you think you can use your self-control to keep your use of Instagram to, say, 10 minutes at a clip. Good luck.
Yeah.
And even if you can, people say, but I do that anyway. I'm like, all right, how much time do you spend sending memes and links from Instagram or fill in the blank platform to your friends in group chat? How much time does that consume?
I spend a fair amount of time on Instagram and Twitter posting things related to the podcast, but I don't have someone to do that for me. And I actually enjoy doing it, and it challenges me in certain ways. But I completely agree with everything you're saying. I also want to note that you didn't say that you're on Twitter possibly to meet somebody, which is more a statement about Twitter.
Yeah, it's not the friendliest neighborhood I've found.
Yeah.
And I would say Twitter has its use cases. I find it useful in some respects. It has become much less useful and much less practical in the last year with a lot of the product changes. But it has its place. It's not on my phone. It was on my phone for a very brief period of time. I do not want, I find that my ability to be still and calm is eroded if I am too easily able to escape boredom. If you cease to have the ability to be bored for 5 to 10 minutes, I think that makes you very fragile and makes you very easy to manipulate also. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of forces at play online that want to manipulate or shape your behavior in different ways. So I feel like it is imperative for me to cultivate the ability to just sit still and not consume the 5 minutes in line waiting to get into a restaurant by hopping on Twitter or Instagram. So that's part of the reason they're not on my phone.
Could you tell us about Cock Punch?
Yeah, I can tell you about Cock Punch. So Cock Punch is a creative project intended once again to make me less precious about protecting whatever brand I think I might have. And this is an investment in my long-term mental health also. And I think in my career flexibility, my willingness to experiment. Cock Punch could be a long story, but the gist of it is I wanted to experiment with fiction writing. I've been saying this for years and I've never done it. That's the backdrop. On top of that, I have wanted to get back into illustration and work in the visual arts, which I did for a long time when I was younger. And I've not done that consistently. Why not? Because I haven't had accountability. I haven't had deadlines. It hasn't been in the calendar. This should sound somewhat familiar by now. And at the same time, I was becoming very interested in Web3 and what was happening in the world of NFTs. This is probably 2020. And I know they've developed a fairly negative connotation for a lot of good reasons. But I started to think about fundraising for early stage science. And if I could conduct an experiment as a proof of concept with different novel approaches to fundraising. So rather than just calling the rich friends who might sort of bend to the pressure or be willing to fund, I wanted to look at, say, crowdfunding back in the day. Then I wanted to look at different options for perhaps art auctions. And I was going to do this with contemporary art. This is many years ago, and in the process of wanting to fund the Hopkins Center focused on psychedelic and consciousness research, which was the first of its kind in the United States. And the technology gave me the opportunity to learn about a new, let's just call it, set of technologies. So to develop skills and knowledge. It would give me the opportunity to reconnect and deepen friendships with a number of my very, very smart friends who are playing in that area. Also test fundraising, also get back into fiction and art, and all of that combined into this thing that I ended up calling Cock Punch because it made me laugh. And you know what? Man, if you take your work too seriously, you're going to burn out before you get the really serious work done. And I think it was Bertrand Russell who said it's a sure sign of an impending nervous breakdown if you start taking your work too seriously or believing your work to be very, very serious. And for that reason, I wanted to give it an absurd name that would also have some word of mouth benefit and to see what would happen. Honestly, just see what would happen. Because I was like, all right, look, what is honestly the worst thing that happens? Like people write a bunch of pieces where they're like shaking their fist at the sky. How dare Tim Ferriss create a art project called Cock Punch?
You could turn it around on them and just say that what they were doing is a cock punch.
No, well,
attempting.
Well, that was kind of the thing. That was kind of part of the thinking that it would just be entertaining to watch people seriously trying to critique something called Cock Punch. And the upshot of that is it raised almost $2 million, sold out in something like 30 minutes or 40 minutes for the foundation. All that money went to SciSam Foundation. All of that money has already been distributed in the form of grants.
Wonderful.
And along the way, I got to work with artists, with programmers, learn new technologies, reconnect with old friends. And now we're back in touch, and it's extremely fun to be back in touch with these folks. And I've written the equivalent of a short book in fiction in the form of short stories that are this fantasy world building exercise for me. And I'm having a blast. So I'm exercising new creative muscles that has led me back into the worlds of comic books, which I haven't created yet, led me back into the worlds of gaming, led me back into my fascination with tabletop gaming because I played D&D forever when I was a kid. That was my refuge as a runt who got the crap kicked out of him left and right. And I'm having just a blast. And the takeaway, I think, on some level is that you should do things. Should is a loaded term. It's helpful for me to consider doing things that give me energy, right? Because if we say, all right, time management is fine, but time doesn't really have any practical value unless you have attention, right? So then there's attentional management. But that attention is limited also physically and sort of metaphorically by energy, right? So you have like substrates, diets, neurotransmitters, and so on. If you do not have the basic batteries required, the rest of the things that are higher up on that pyramid can't really be executed properly. So for me, it's like, okay, let's say Cock Punch doesn't do anything. It's total failure, right? Coming back to like,
well, it already raised $2 million for science.
It did.
And that science could be breakthrough science. So
it could.
So Cock Punch, sorry, I yelled. Sorry. So Cock Punch is, at least thus far, a success.
It is. But coming back to Seth Godin's question, I asked myself, would I do this even if it turns out to be a complete failure financially? And I was like, yes, because I think the relationships and the skills, even if this quote unquote fails from the outside looking in, those will transcend this project and be life affirming and helpful and fun in other areas. And that's proven to be true, even though the project is ongoing. And I have more energy now because of this ridiculous project. I'm very proud of the fiction, actually. This ridiculous project called Cock Punch. People can find The Legend of Cock Punch on any fine provider of podcasts, and hired voice actors, did the scripting, the production. It hit #1 fiction worldwide on Apple Podcasts for a while. The whole thing's hilarious.
And if you could you explain a little bit about the characters in Cock Punch?
Yeah, I can.
Who's punching whose cock?
Yeah.
Or which cocks are punching?
Yeah, which cocks are punching which. How does this work? So here we go. All right. So The Legend of Cock Punch takes place in this realm called Varlata. And Varlata is being described through the narrator, who we know as the seventh scribe. We don't know much about the seventh scribe, but the seventh scribe makes an appearance in episode 1 as the reliable, but possibly sometimes unreliable narrator of this space. And there's a mind-bending time component where there's something called restarts. Something like The Edge of Tomorrow, if people have ever seen this movie, where time restarts, maybe like Groundhog Day. Time restarts. And it's unclear as of yet in the story why that is the case. But people basically snap into being. They know who they are and what they do, but they have no real memories to speak of. So the world is constantly being reconstructed and pieced together by these scribes, the seventh of which is the narrator. So you might read into this that I am a fan of fantasy, Tolkien, you name it, Ursula K. Le Guin, The Wizard of Earthsea, etc. Then there are 8 primary houses. These are the greater houses. Some might call them clans, and they have different characteristics. Just prior to this seventh scribe beginning his piecing together, which turns into this story in the podcast, there was a warring states period. This much he's been able to establish. And the peacekeeping mechanism that was devised is something called the Great Games. And the Great Games is a combat competition. And the 8 greater houses send their best fighters who've been vetted through preliminary competitions to the Great Games, which is in the free trade zone, which is this one place where all of the races mingle and trade and so on. And all these characters happen to be anthropomorphized roosters. So they have generally each one gauntlet of some type, and clearly they punch each other with this gauntlet, and there are many other types of weapons. So the colloquial nickname for this Olympics of combat is Cock Punch. And that is the etymology. so the scholars say, of Cock Punch, the legend of Cock Punch. And there's a lot more to it. And there are many wrinkles, a lot of Easter eggs in this entire story. The idea came to me, and it started off as a bit of a farce, right? It was just going to be something funny, see if it works. Maybe it raises some money, very light lift. But once I got into the fiction, I started taking it super seriously. So it's become very, very elaborate. It's become really, really elaborate. And I'm loving it. It's great. So who knows where it'll go? I have no idea. That's part of the reason why I called it an emergent long fiction project. Yeah. I didn't call it an NFT project. I was like, this is an emergent long fiction project where I'm taking inputs from the audience. I'm watching very closely what people understand or don't understand or find interesting. I'm looking at, for instance, what is generated when I host an AI assisted art competition, which I did with the fans. And a lot of these bits and pieces get integrated in some fashion into this thing that chapter by chapter is coalescing. So that's Cock Punch.
Amazing.
And I had to buy cockpunch.com and the @cockpunch Twitter handle.
You had to buy it from somebody?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. The whole process.
I don't want to ask what it was being used for prior to your purchase.
It was not being used for fantasy world building. I'll put it that way.
Got it. Amazing. And for so many reasons, I have so much to say about it. First of all, your excitement about it is tangible.
Yeah.
The energy you have around it is infectious. And while I don't want to go into the total depth and contour of what Paul Conti has been telling me over the last week of preparing this mental health series about what's really great in life that we all should cultivate, it has a lot to do with this generative drive, which has a lot to do with positive energy, not just positive thinking, but positive energy. But this triad of peace, contentment, and delight. And as you were explaining it, it's clear that it brings you great peace, contentment, and delight as action terms, not like sit there and just hover in the basking in it. It's just so clear that this was a great idea. And I love that you started it as a way to kind of, I don't know, like knock the fear out of yourself a little bit by knocking a little fear into the whole thing.
Yeah.
Like what would happen if you let your mind go and allowed yourself to explore this?
And what permission would it buy you if it's not a total disaster? This is true for the 4-hour body too. I'm like, what if this partially works? It's not even a home run, but let's say I get on base. What permission does this then buy me? What other impossibles, in quotation marks, am I willing to challenge? And I was able to make the hop from one category in the bookstore to a completely different category. And then the sky's the limit. I was like, I can do anything. I can do whatever I want. I've given myself permission and the market has given me permission. But the most important first step is you giving yourself permission. And with, say, Cock Punch, as ludicrous as it is, now that I've done that, my career hasn't ended, hasn't had any negative impact on my career whatsoever. I'm like, okay, that's actually kind of surprising.
No, to the contrary, it seems like it gives you energy. It's raised money for science. Is it still raising money? Is there still an opportunity for people to contribute?
It's sold out. If people want to contribute to, say, the early stage science, and let's just say specifically psychedelics, I would say it's very, very hard to get a very solid understanding of the field and the shifting sands and the projects and so on. It's very rapidly changing. So I would say just provide money to a foundation that's already doing good work. It could be River Styx Foundation. It could be Beckley Foundation. My foundation, SciSay Foundation, I think does pretty good work.
And SciSay is not just the journalism fellowships; they're also it's funding for psychedelics.
Oh yeah, there's tons of stuff. There's a project page on SciSayFoundation.org. You can see the projects. There are probably 15 to 20 of them, and they can see the basic science, all the way from really basic science, looking at possible mechanisms of action for something like DIPT, which is a very strange compound that
DIPT.
Yeah, most people aren't going to know it. That produces profound auditory distortions and hallucinations in humans. Very hard to animal model. And from that all the way up to really sophisticated imaging studies, from that to, say, at least a year or two ago, supporting phase 3 trials for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, then the journalism, then the this, then the that, but a lot of different scientific studies that are being supported. So that's very exciting to me. But the cock punch side of things is all done. Money's been distributed, and maybe I'll do more of this kind of thing. But I might take a different approach. I feel like, okay, I learned what I feel I wanted to learn from that, and maybe I'll try something new next time.
Well, one thing's clear: nobody tells you what to do, except you. But that's vetted through many important filters, like structured filters and very thoughtful filters are the words that come to mind when I think about your process as you're sharing.
And
I'll
add one more thing, which is one of the sources of joy of Cock Punch is that it is not overplanned. I set some initial conditions, and now it's emergent. And as someone who has hyper-analyzed and meticulously planned most of my life for decades, I think it's helpful to have an improv component. So if you are a hyper planner, if you're a hyper measurer, if you like that degree of control, maybe you should try something that's a little less controlled. Take an improv class, try fiction writing, do something that isn't totally scripted where you don't know the outcome. I think it's really good medicine for people. Just like if you spend all your time in a yoga class, maybe you should spend one day a week lifting weights, see what that's like. And if you spend all your time in the gym and you can barely touch your toes, maybe you should do some more downward dog, try some yoga. Similar. I think the spectrum of hyper planned to completely free flowing and improv provides ample opportunity to enrich themselves and maybe address some weaknesses at the same time. So for me, Cock Punch has been incredibly therapeutic. Probably the first time that anyone's ever uttered that sentence, but yes.
Probably.
Yeah.
But that's part of what makes it so cool.
Yeah, totally.
I love it. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share with us a little bit about your mindset, maybe even your motivation, but certainly your mindset around sharing some of the hard personal tribulations that you've shared. In preparation for this discussion today, I went back to some of those posts that you did and the podcasts that you did around this. And I'd listened to them at the time, and, they deal with quite serious violations of childhood and of self. And they're hard. I mean, they're hard to listen to, and I can only imagine they must be even far, far harder to experience. And I was curious what led to your willingness to do that. And I have my own ideas about what might have motivated it, but I'd like to hear it from you.
Sure. Happy to talk about it. And I think there are two particular examples that come to mind. So one is my near suicide in college. And if people search some practical thoughts on suicide and my name, it'll pop right up. I mean, if you just search my name and suicide, it'll probably pop right up. Pretty well indexed at this point, which is very deliberate. People can look at the URL structure for a little wink and hat tip. It'll tell you something about optimizing for Google if you look at it. I'll just tell you, the URL spells out how to commit suicide. But clearly I'm not teaching people how to commit suicide. But I wanted that to be a honeypot for some of that traffic because it's a lot easier now to find that type of practical implementation advice. And it's a bit harder to find, I think, compelling intervention. So first of all, if you're feeling suicide, obviously call a suicide hotline, please. Right? That's sometimes the last thing that people want to hear when they are in a place of suicidal ideation. And the reason I ended up writing a long post about this, which was terrifying to write because I had never told my parents, I had never told my closest friends. This was a secret. This was a dark, dark secret. And I wrote about it because I went to an event in San Francisco. I was interviewed on stage by Jason Calacanis, who's a friend and a very good interviewer, at an event. And after I got off stage, a bunch of people approached me and I was saying hi and taking photos and signing things and so on. And there was one young man there, very well dressed, which isn't really relevant. It was striking because in San Francisco, sometimes people are very underdressed, and he had dressed up for it. Like, he'd taken it seriously, and he was in a suit and tie, and he asked me if I could sign a book for his brother. And I said, sure, no problem. And I asked him, what would you like me to write to your brother? And he kind of blanked. He didn't kind of blank. He totally blanked. But the look behind his eyes was unusual. It wasn't just, I don't know what to say blank. There was something else behind it. And I could tell that he felt under pressure. And I said, no problem. Take your time. I'll tell you what, I'll just chat with a couple of other people and I'll sign the book. No problem. I'm not going anywhere. And chatted with the other folks. And then he asked if he could just walk me to the elevator and then I could sign the book. I was like, sure. And he explained to me as I walked to the elevator how his brother had been a huge fan of mine and that I'd really kept his brother afloat for a long time. And eventually his brother killed himself, and that they'd kept his room exactly how it was. And he wanted me to sign the book so that he could put the book in his brother's room. And he asked me if I'd ever considered talking about mental health and mental health challenges publicly, because he thought it would really help a lot of people. And that just, I'm like feeling myself tear up right now. It was so crushing to hear this story. And totally unbeknownst to him, I had a lot of history with depressive episodes. And when I say near suicide, I had it on the calendar. I had a plan. I was going to kill myself. I knew exactly how I was going to do it. I knew where I was going to do it. I knew all of the variables that I needed to account for to get it done. And the only reason that didn't happen, for people who don't have the context, which most people won't, is I had tried to reserve a book at Firestone Library. This is at Princeton, which had something to do with suicide. It was like assisted suicide, like the clinician's guide to euthanasia, something like that. And it wasn't in. And I had forgotten to change my address at the registrar's office. I was taking a year away from school. And that was to focus on finishing my thesis. It was to try a few jobs, but I'd ended up in a very bad place and was feeling very isolated. And my friends were graduating a year ahead of me. And I was stuck on this thesis. And there's a lot of backstory that I won't bore people with. But it got to the point where I decided, not that objectively my life is bad. I think this is where people who haven't experienced depression get a little confused, or it's hard for them to identify when they give advice to a depressed person. Because you might say to a depressed person, like, but look, your life is so great. Like, there's this, there's that, there's this. And for a lot of depressed people to say, yeah, I know. I look at that and I can't fix my state because I am broken. And if this is how I'm going to have to live forever, with being this broken and dysfunctional, and to have this internal hell that I live day by day, I just want to escape. It's like someone jumping out of a burning building. It's like they don't want to kill themselves, but they're jumping out of a burning building. And so I had it on the calendar, and thank God this was back.
Chasing dreams by the sea, echoes of a distant melody. In the nights, just you and me. Photographs and shades of gold, stories that we've never told, memories that never grow old. In this heart, they're always bold. Time moves on, but we stay here in the moments crystal clear, echoes of the yesteryear. In our hearts we hold them near. Fading memories in the light, lost in awful whispers, tales of woe. In the hearts we find our say. In the dawn we'll never stray. Fading memories in the light, lost in whispers of the night. In the silence we take flight, holding on to what feels right. As the days turn into years, through the laughter, through the tears, in the echoes all our steers, in these dreams we face our fears. As the days turn into years, through the laughter, through the tears, in the echoes all our steers, in these dreams we face our fears.
Back when they would still send you a physical reminder in the mail, a little postcard that says your book is in. And that card went to my parents' house, and my mom saw it and panicked and called me. And I lied. I said it was for a friend who went to Rutgers who was doing a project on A, B, and C, but it was just enough to kind of snap me out of the trance and realize that killing yourself is like putting on a suicide vest with explosives and walking into a room of all the people you care the most about and blowing yourself up. So that snapped me out of it. But no one knew this. This guy certainly didn't know that. And that is when I went home and thought about it and just decided, okay, there's a chance if I write this, it's not certain, but there's a chance that this might help someone. It might prevent someone from doing what I was almost about to do. And so I spent months getting this post written and put it out. And I know for a fact it has saved minimum dozens of lives. And there are other things, including a very extensive list of resources. And so that gave me, I suppose, not a toe in the water, but sort of jumping feet first into the deep end, an experience of being that vulnerable. And this was a long time ago. I mean, this is, I want to say at least 8 to 10 years ago when I put that post out. And then I want to say it was just before COVID lockdown. I was in Costa Rica visiting a friend. I was with my girlfriend at the time, and she knew a secret of mine. And she was one of maybe 2 or 3 people who knew that I'd been sexually abused when I was a kid by a babysitter's son from 2 to 4, roughly. And routinely, all the time kind of thing. And yeah, like what you're envisioning is what happens. So it was not good. And that had been compartmentalized and locked away for my whole life. I was like, that's in the past. We're focused on moving forward. And nothing to be fixed, nothing to fix. And that was my perspective on things. It turned out it wasn't quite that simple, right? And so I had done a lot of work, a lot of therapy, used psychedelic assisted therapies as well, which once again are not all upside potential. There are some significant risks. But I had come a long way. And my plan had always been to wait until my parents passed because I didn't want them to blame themselves for this. And then to write a book. And there was something, though, at the time when I was having dinner with my girlfriend that was dissatisfying about that plan. There's something about it that bothered me, and I couldn't quite put a finger on it. And I was talking to her about it. And she said, that's going to take a long time. She's like, have you ever thought about how many people are going to pass away or die or suffer between now and when you publish that book? And I thought about it, and it was at that dinner that I decided to at least record a podcast covering this terrain. I was not at all convinced that I wanted to publish it. I was terrified of publishing it. Also because it meant opening myself up to a lot of conversations, or maybe just hurtful commentary online. Who knows? Like, there are a lot of idiots out there, and a lot of otherwise fine people who are idiots on the internet. So I was very hesitant. Ultimately decided I didn't want to do it as a one-man show. I didn't want to make it a monologue. So I asked my friend Debbie Millman, who had been on my podcast. She's an amazing graphic designer and teacher, but she had unexpectedly on my podcast, based on some of my questions, for the first time publicly told her story about being sexually abused. And so I had leaned on her in years after that in private. And I asked her if she'd be willing to have a conversation with me about our respective journeys and what it felt like, what it looked like, what helped, what didn't help, what worked, what didn't, to provide at the very least a glimmer of hope for people who were keeping some of these dark secrets or contending with them, not knowing what to do with them. And we had that conversation, and I sat on it, and then I put it out and decided in advance that I would not look at any social media for at least several weeks afterwards. If my team saw anything on social media or got emails, I didn't want to see anything other than positive feedback, which is not my de facto. I'm usually eager to solicit constructive feedback, but in this case, I knew that my own position was too vulnerable. I didn't want to open up the possibility of destabilizing myself. And I put it out, and I think it's the most important podcast I've ever put out. So I kind of felt like my job was done from a podcasting perspective after that. And it's been incredibly gratifying. I think it has certainly helped a fair number of people. And it was also really hard, because what I didn't anticipate was, I would say, of my really super high performing close male friends, maybe half reached out to me to tell someone for the first time about their extremely awful, graphic firsthand experience of being sexually abused. The percentages were mind-blowing. Like the actual percentages were super, super, super high, which is part of the reason I mentioned earlier. I think it's good to spend a little bit of time in those empty spaces to see, am I, in a positive, energetic sense, pursuing something good, or am I running away from demons whipping my back? And for a lot of those guys, I'm sure it's true for a lot of women too, like they find medication through intense focus and achievement, which is super adaptive in a lot of ways, but it doesn't always have lifetime reliability. And that's the story.
It's impossible to hear those stories, your story, without feeling some substantial emotion. I'm not trying to intellectualize. It's both of those aspects of your history that you shared are huge. Right? They really are. They're obviously huge for you, and they're huge in terms of the positive impact in the world. I know this because I have read the comments, right? Mm-hmm. And I've talked to people who have listened to those podcasts and read those blogs and have similar or maybe different stories of trauma. But I think as with your work in the psychedelic space, as with your work in the physical augmentation space, whatever you want to call it, it's apparent that you're willing to be first man in on a lot of things, and really you're sitting alone there in those moments. And these categories of revealing trauma are, in my mind anyway, so much more substantial in terms of their impact, positive impact. And the other aspects, 4 Hour Body and psychedelic work, et cetera, is also tremendously impactful. So that's saying a lot. So just want to say thank you for your bravery. And
Thanks, Andrew.
yeah, it's crazy because I think that a lot of people can imagine telling a story or to a close friend or something, but to put it out into the world, it's like, it's huge. Like, you don't know how that's going to ripple. And you've been a real pioneer and example for me, for Lex, for other people, in revealing things not like that, but different. And Pt2 has recently been opening up about some serious challenges that he's had in his book. He does that on podcasts. He's been doing it. So, yet another category, arguably the most important category for exploration and sharing and, thoughtful bravery, right? Because you didn't just put it out there in any form. So one thing I do know by experience is there's nothing weirder than being told thank you for the painful thing that you did. So I don't want to push that too far, but I'd be remiss if I didn't, because it really has its impact. And for doing it again here today, because that huge thanks for doing that.
Yeah, my pleasure. And I'll also say, I got advice from a very, very experienced psychedelic facilitator at one point, who said, take the pain and make it part of your medicine. And the way I think that applies here is we all experience pain. We all experience suffering. Many of us have experienced trauma of one type or another. And that can consume you. I mean, it can consume you. But it's like fire, right? It can consume you, but you can also harness it and use it for different things. And I'm not going to hedge. I'll say I know for a fact that there are people I've spoken to who are suicidal. And by the way, I'm not inviting everyone who's listening, if you are suicidal, to reach out to me, because it won't work. I've had to disengage from that because it gets too heavy, right? Just to engage one-on-one with people who are suicidal. But there are resources in that post I mentioned, the practical thoughts on suicide. But let's just talk about closer friends. People you would never suspect in a million years, who are this close to blowing their brains out. People folks would recognize in some cases. The fact that I was also there once is why they listen to me. Because unfortunately, I'm a subject matter expert, man. I have credibility. And that actually is very redeeming. It provides some meaning to the suffering that I experienced. It's like, okay, here I am. For whatever host of reasons, I am put in this place and time with this person. And they don't trust the input of these other people they're talking to, because those people don't know what it's like. But I can look at this person in the eye and be like, oh, I know. And that's just a different thing. So you can find a way to transmute that pain into something meaningful, into a gift that hopefully you can share in some way. Not necessarily with the whole wide world, just one person. That's a big deal. One person's a big deal. There's a lot out there that is intended for mass consumption that gets in front of millions of people. Doesn't really impact a single person very much. So even if you don't have a podcast, you don't have books, if you have the ability to sit down with one person and really make an impact, that's actually more meaningful than most of the crap that gets put out there. So take heart.
Amen to that. I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about the roles you see yourself in. You know, I had this list coming in here of, okay, you've done the exploration of the health sphere, self-experimentation, you've been an investor, you are an investor, you're a podcaster, I think these are more than titles. I think titles are great, but titles are what we get from other people telling us what we do or deciding what we do. I'm more interested in how you think about yourself, like your own role identity. And, I have to assume you've spent a little bit of time on this. Like if one were to go through the checklist of possible roles.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. I confess I do this. I think I think I check the box of animal because we're animals after all. And we're, humans.
You still pole dancing? I think you use a pole dancer.
Absolutely not. Are you still tango dancing?
I'm planning on getting back into it.
Great.
That does have some background.
I have Argentine lineage, and I'm embarrassed to say I don't know tango. But
you got the mate in the green room, so you're set.
My grandparents did tango into their 80s, I think. Late 80s, yeah. Late 80s, yeah. Ate steak and smoked cigarettes, and lived until their 90s.
Argentine diet of champions.
Exactly. But I'm curious about the roles that you see yourself in. Like, role identity to me is so important in terms of where we see ourselves now and where we see ourselves going forward. And who knows, maybe you don't have any role identity plan, but what are some boxes that you see yourself in now that you really strongly identify with? And then what are some boxes that you'd like to check off going forward?
So current boxes, I would say the two that I probably identify with most, maybe three, but I'll focus on two. Experimentalist, which can take a lot of forms. That can apply to a whole lot of different spheres. So experimentalist, and then teacher. And for the longest time, long time, I thought eventually I would go back and actually be a 9th grade teacher, because I feel like that is such a critical window for so many kids where they can either hit an inflection point and go in a really good direction, or they can go in a really bad direction. And I certainly saw that on Long Island with a lot of my friends, a lot of overdoses, a bunch of friends who have died of opiate addiction and various things. And I had some intervention with mentors early on that sort of flipped the switch on the railroad track and sent me in a different direction. So I thought for a long time I would go back and be a 9th grade teacher. And my impulse to experiment leads to enthusiasm for teaching, if that makes any sense. Because I feel like as good as I might be or decent at taking a complex subject, deconstructing it, applying 80-20, putting things in order, and learning things very quickly, which includes stress testing assumptions in that sort of assumed progression for skill, like language learning. There's so many myths in language learning, as an example. If it takes me, say, 6 months to become reasonably competent in field X, I can usually get other people to that same point of competence in a third of that time. So for me, it's very gratifying to teach. And I view all the books as teaching tools. I'm no Tolstoy. I recognize I'm not the world's greatest writer. I take the writing seriously. I don't half-ass it. I do many revisions, even for Cockpunch. It's like 27 revisions for a short story called Cockpunch. So I take it seriously, but I recognize that I'm not the world's greatest wordsmith. But I am looking for outcomes in readers or listeners, and I view my job as that of teacher. So I'd say experimentalist and teacher are the two. And those both go a long way, and applies to, say, dog training. Ran lots of experiments. And then,
for those listening, Tim just looked under the table. One thing I should have said at the beginning, and I did not, is that this is the first Huberman Lab podcast to feature a guest who brought their dog. So we have Molly is here as well. And we're absolutely delighted. There has not been a dog on the Huberman Lab podcast since Costello passed away. And I'm, practically floating in delight that Molly's here today. Yeah, she's amazing. And you've done an amazing job training her too. So
thank you. Yeah, she's laying right next to my feet, licking my hand as I speak.
So good.
And I'd say if I were to expand that by one, I would probably say explore, but the exploring goes hand in hand with the experimentation. So that could be geographic exploration. It could be spending time with people who are excellent at anything in any field and seeing where that gingerbread trail leads me. And I think the exploration and the experimentation are, for me, bedfellows. They go together.
What about roles that you would like to explore or potentially see yourself in? I mean, I don't have a magic wand, but if I did, as a fellow podcaster, and I consider you a friend, I would say, okay, like if I could wand you to the success in a given role, that wouldn't be the way it would work. And that wouldn't be as gratifying as having to figure it all out, because that's part of your machinery, as you just told us. So yeah, what are some life roles that you're interested in expanding and, or stepping into that you haven't explored?
Yeah, I'd say more artists, more artistry, especially in the visual sense, because I wanted to be a comic book penciler for a really long time, got paid as an illustrator towards the end of high school and during college, so illustrated books and magazines and so on. And then I just dropped it. I dropped it when I graduated because that was kid stuff and it was time to get serious and be an adult. And I just cold turkey, just stopped all of it. And so the skills have atrophied a lot, but there's still a bit in there.
I've seen some posts on Instagram that were quite good.
So I'm still messing around.
Yeah.
Still messing around, and especially when I have some structure, I do well. So I'd like to pursue that. I would like to experiment with animation. So I don't know if animator would be the right label, because I most likely would not be doing the animation myself, but playing a role in visual art would be one. Father would be another one, eventually. And try not to be attached to it, but we all play games of various types. And if we get really good at certain games that are socially rewarded, then you make money doing a podcast or investing or whatever it might be. But when the sort of ramp of my learning starts to flatten out a bit, I tend to get bored of those games. And I think that certainly one of the biggest adventures must be parenthood. So at some point, I think father would be on there. And I should say, this is very judgmental of me to say, but I think there's a big difference between wanting to be a parent and wanting to have kids. I'm very cautious about saying I want to have kids, because that doesn't automatically imply you want to be a good parent, which is also why I thought it was very important for me to spend a lot of time training Molly. And
a lot of learning there, right?
Yeah. To see, it's like, all right, am I going to do the heavy lifting and the hard work? Recognizing that kids are not deferred dogs, but I do think there are actually a lot of similarities in terms of just predictive ability. If you see someone who has dogs that are terribly trained, Look at their kids. You might see some similarities.
My good friend, I'll out him here, who's a MD PhD, is their chair of ophthalmology at Stanford, Jeff Goldberg. I once asked him if he has any pets, and he said that he and his wife had 3 children as preparation for having a dog.
That's hilarious. There's a quote also from a book called Don't Shoot the Dog, which is a terrible title, but excellent book, written by Karen Pryor, who was an aquatic mammal trainer. So she's training dolphins and whales and so on, which don't respond to negative reinforcement. You can't really hit them with a rolled up newspaper if they don't do what you want. And there's a quote in that book, which is something along the lines of, I can't remember the attribution, it's another trainer, and it was, people should not be allowed to have children until they've successfully trained a chicken. Because also chickens, like they just don't have the brain power to respond to much negative reinforcement. So you have to coax them to do what you want them to do with positive reinforcement. And I mean, operant in classical conditioning, it's kind of same across the board. Whether you're like the CIA trying to train cockroaches to flip light switches, not making that one up, by the way, or training a whale or training a cat or training a human. Training sounds bad. Cultivating a wonderful human.
Yeah.
Then I think there's a lot to be learned across the board. So I've successfully proven to myself that I can keep a dog alive and happy.
Yeah, and train up another happy nervous system.
Yeah.
You know, curate another nervous system. That's a big deal.
Oh, yeah. Well, she's also like my external nervous system. So we sort of work in tandem. I pay a lot of attention to how she relates to different people.
Yeah, I saw earlier today. I mean, as someone who is the owner of a bulldog mastiff who knew one command, which was wait, which is by default the easiest thing to train a bulldog, because when you, by the way, folks, if you stop a bulldog on the street to scratch them and they look delighted, they might like you, but chances are they're just really relieved that they get to stop. So, Costello, he had a forebrain and he was smart about what he needed to be smart about, but Molly is exceptional. Like, she knows where she needs to be and she's super connected to you, and she knows a ton of commands. It was ridiculous. Our staff was like delighting in the number of things that Tim could get her to do just by looking at her.
Yeah. She's also quite calm out of the box, which helps. Although it makes it harder in some respects to train because she doesn't have much food drive.
If you like those Maui Nui sticks,
she did like the Maui Nui sticks. Yeah, she loves the Maui Nui venison sticks, but I'll say 2 things. So first is, if your dog is a spaz about food, that's actually great news. It will make your dog very easy to train in some respects. Read Don't Shoot the Dog. It's excellent. And there's some others I could recommend. I had a woman named Susan Garrett on my podcast because I wanted an objective measure of successful dog training, and competitors have objective measures. So she was a dog agility champion for many years, which has a lot of metrics. So anyway, I had her on for people who are interested. But the tip that I got from one dog trainer early on, because I was trying to train Molly and I was using just some of her kibble. I'd like put some kibble in a bag and carry it around. And she was like, "What are you doing?" And I said, "What do you mean? What am I doing?" She's like, "Is that kibble?" I'm like, "Yeah, it's kibble." And she's like, "Hey pal," she's like, "You're at a crowded bar. You got to tip with 20s
Nice.
to get your dog's attention. You take your puppy to the dog park. It's like squirrels, other dogs, grass, piss on the pavement, whatever it happens to be. You have to have good treats. So if your dog isn't responding, chances are maybe you're trying to tip with singles."
I love it. I love it. Well, thank you for sharing the roles you see yourself in and the ones that you'd like to step into more. I certainly feel I have the jurisdiction to say that you are an exceptional experimentalist and a phenomenal teacher. We've seen this across so many. You're welcome. And I'm not just speaking for myself. I'm speaking for so many other people as well. I mean, we've seen this across so many domains. It's like blogging, podcasting, book writing, stage lecturing, being a guest on a podcast, and on and on. And in terms of the roles that you want to expand into more, I can't wait to see the illustrations that emerge. Yeah, please do grow that flame, because I'm excited for what comes out. Cock Punch being just the first of them.
Leading the charge.
Yeah. I can say, because I know, because I have one, and because I I've observed many kids and friends who are fathers. You're going to be an exceptional father.
Thanks,
I'm
Andrew.
absolutely confident of that.
Thanks,
So,
man.
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. And I want to say thanks for taking the time to talk with me today. I've been looking forward to this so much. My team knows this. Wait, we were sort of buzzing like, we've had some heavy hitters on this podcast. We only look to the top 1% in field, and they're, incredibly credentialed by whatever standards we happen to be exploring. And they have to be people that I really want to talk to. So, I have so much respect for what you do and the way you do it. You've certainly inspired me. This podcast would not exist. I don't think the genre of podcasting would exist and look the way that it does had you not made the decision to start podcasting. And in anticipation of this episode, I did put out a ping on Twitter for questions, and there were many, many of them. That maybe we'll do a Q&A sometime, maybe not, who knows. Mm-hmm. But, one of the questions that really stood out to me was, how does Tim feel about all these other people coming into all the spaces that he's worked mm-hmm. and doing successful work that builds off so much of what he's done? And I'll let you answer, but for me, I can say that I've been positively inspired and built so much of what we've been doing here and what I think about based on the ways that you've podcasted and communicate with the public and maintain your stance and integrity in the way that you interact with people. It's really inspiring. And you've always been so gracious to me and so humble and so giving. And at the same time, I know there's a fierce guy in there who likes to get it done. So once again, thanks for being first man in. Thanks for taking on all the roles that you have and that you are and that you will. And thanks for being a giver. We all benefit.
Thanks, Andrew. I really appreciate you saying all that. And I want people to just get after it, take things seriously, have fun, and be really, really good. So watching, for instance, what you've done, which has been so spectacular, so well executed, makes me super happy. And I don't view anyone as competition. In the podcasting world, for instance, in the book world, I don't view it that way either. And I just hope that people keep experimenting, pushing the envelope. And if people aren't, say, getting better over time, if people aren't following who are substantially better than me in all of these ways, then I would be super disappointed. So every time I see someone doing something really impressive or doing something I never would have thought of, I get so extremely excited. I find it really fun to watch. So appreciate you also just getting out there and hard charging and taking your podcast as seriously as you do. I mean, I've seen the notes, I've seen the setup, I've met the team. It's very inspiring for me also. It makes me want to dust off my cleats and get back on the field. So,
oh, man, you've never left the field and you've had a hand in it all. So thank you so much. And hope you'll come back and visit us again here.
Yeah, I hope so. It's been a real pleasure. I've been looking forward to this for a long time as well. And I appreciate you inviting me on.
Till next time.
Till next time, man.
Thank you for joining me for today's discussion with Tim Ferriss. I hope you found it to be as informative and as actionable as I did. For links to Tim's books, as well as for a link to his weekly blog, please see the show note captions. You'll also find a link to Tim's podcast, the Tim Ferriss Podcast, and I highly recommend that you subscribe and listen to the Tim Ferriss Podcast. If you're learning from and or enjoying this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's a terrific zero-cost way to support us. In addition, please subscribe to the podcast on both Spotify and Apple. And on both Spotify and Apple, you can leave us up to a 5-star review. If you have questions for me or comments about the podcast or guests that you'd like me to include on the Huberman Lab podcast, please put those in the comments section on YouTube. I do read all the comments. Please also check out the sponsors mentioned at the beginning and throughout today's episode. That's the best way to support this podcast. Not on today's episode, but on many previous episodes of the Huberman Lab podcast, we discuss supplements. While supplements aren't necessary for everybody, many people derive tremendous benefit from them for things like enhancing sleep, for hormone support, and for focus. The Huberman Lab podcast is proud to have partnered with Momentous Supplements. To see the supplements discussed on the Huberman Lab podcast, go to Live Momentous, spelled O-U-S. So that's livemomentous.com/Huberman. Again, that's livemomentous.com/Huberman. If you're not already following us on social media, I am Huberman Lab on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And at all those places, I discuss science and science-related tools, some of which overlaps with the content of the Huberman Lab podcast, but much of which often does not overlap with the content of the Huberman Lab podcast. So again, it's Huberman Lab on all social media platforms. In addition, if you haven't subscribed to our Neural Network newsletter, it's a zero-cost monthly newsletter that provides summaries of podcast episodes as well as toolkits. For instance, toolkits for optimizing sleep, or toolkits for learning and neuroplasticity, or for deliberate cold exposure, or for dopamine, and on and on. To sign up for the Neural Network newsletter, simply go to hubermanlab.com, go to the menu, scroll down to newsletter, and provide your email. We do not share your email with anybody. Thank you once again for joining me for today's discussion with Tim Ferriss. And last, but certainly not least, thank you for your interest in science.